Bert was sitting on his bunk looking around his berth waiting for the "man the rails" command to come. After almost 5 months of deployment, his ship, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, was almost back to port in Norfolk, Virginia. He really was missing his wife Fran and was excited about returning home. As he stood watching the Elizabeth River banks pass by, he took note of the USS Cole Memorial as he passed it. His mind then went back to Fran, and he wondered how she would be dressed for their reunion after so many months had passed. Finally, after what seemed like forever, most of the crew was able to leave the ship. As Bert crossed over the brow, he started to look for Fran. Even after stepping off the pier, he could not find Fran with his eyes. Bert was positive that Fran knew the date and time the ship was due to moor in. It was not a really hot day considering it was late spring in Hampton Roads, so Bert was walking around looking for Fran. As luck would have it, Bert found one of his shipmates about to leave with his wife and asked him for a ride to his home. "Where is Fran?" he asked. Bert shrugged and said, "Your guess is as good as mine, but for sure Fran is not here." "Yes, Bert, hop in and we can take you home." Bert did have a door key, and he entered his house and found what looked like 2 or 3 weeks of mail in his mailbox. In fact, Bert found where the mailman had left a note to come by and pick up a package in the mailbox. Bert and Fran were living in Navy housing and his pickup was still in the driveway. So, he tried to crank it but discovered the battery was dead. Bert then took out his cell phone and called another buddy who was a riverine and asked for some help. He picked him up and they drove to an auto parts store to buy a replacement battery but discovered his debit card was declined. Bert looked at his buddy and said, "It has only been about a week since payday and a little over $1,000 was deposited in the bank." "No way, that money is all gone," Bert said. The buddy had to get back to Little Creek, so he said, "Let's go by the bank and see what is going on." Bert quickly checked his bank balance and discovered it was about $5. The buddy told Bert, "Let's go back to the store and I will pay for that battery, and you can pay me back next payday." Then Bert discovered his pickup was almost empty of gas. Bert sat down in his living room looking at the photo of Fran and him taken the day they got married. "Where are you, Fran?" he wondered. At the same time Bert was buying that battery, Fran was headed down Interstate 95 and was upset that she forgot all about Bert's arrival back to Norfolk. Fran had been in Maryland with Mark for the last month. She had planned to go home, take out the trash, buy some groceries and empty the mailbox. They used a national bank, so when the Navy deposited Bert's pay, she withdrew all but $5 and put the money in an account in only her name. Fran was also 4 months pregnant, and her stomach would soon start to show Mark's baby. Mark was a Maryland state trooper and was married, but he promised Fran he was going to divorce his wife soon. Several hours later Fran pulled up into the driveway to find Bert's pickup was gone. After Bert had got up, he called another shipmate and asked him if he would help him get to see a chaplain. He did, and they had a short conversation. Because Bert was stationed on a ship, he was able to mess on the ship, so he drove to the pier and boarded his ship and ate dinner, planning to sleep there that night. After Bert left the chaplain he spoke to opened his small phone book and dialed a number of a man he knew that could be of better help in this matter. As soon as he heard the ring, Mike answered and said, "Hello, Mike, this is the chaplain and I have a sailor in need of your help. I am scared he is going to do something stupid and get arrested." "Where is this sailor now?" Mike asked. "He is aboard his ship, and I have spoken to the OD that he is not to leave that ship tonight, and I plan to come by and pick him up." "Can I come with you in the morning?" Mike asked. "I was hoping you would ask that, Mike." "Yes, I think you need to meet him." After the two men agreed on a time, the chaplain called the OD of the ship and asked him to leave a notation in the log of the time to expect him. That next morning Mike left his apartment and drove over to Norfolk and used his pass to enter. He drove to the chapel and shook hands with the chaplain. They drove over to the ship and met Bert. Bert was in tears as he explained Fran was gone and so was his money. He did not even have enough money to buy gas or food. Mike smiled and patted Bert's shoulder and said, "This bad situation will pass." "Do you have enough gas to get to the closest gas station, Bert?" Mike asked. Bert said, Mike, the needle is all the way on empty and I don't dare drive it. Mike told the chaplain to get them to his car and he would take care of Bert's immediate needs. Mike was able to get a 5-gallon can and Bert put that gas in his pickup and then followed Mike and they bought gas. Mike then handed Bert $300 and said, this is to eat on, if you need more call me. Then followed him to his home. Mike was on full alert based on what the chaplain said as well as his own experience when it came to confrontations. Mike was hoping Fran was not at home, but that hope was dashed as soon as Bert pulled into the driveway and saw another car. Mike quickly parked his car and ran at full speed to get ahead of Bert. Fran had opened the door and the first words out of Bert's mouth was, where were you yesterday, Fran? Followed by, where is my pay? By this time Mike was standing between them and Fran was looking at him and finally said, who the fuck are you? Mike was able to calm Bert down and had ignored Fran. Mike was finally able to get Bert to leave with him and they went to get some breakfast. By this time Fran was standing at the door with her mouth wide open watching them drive away. Fran finally went back inside and got out her phone and called Mark telling him that things were going to get ugly and asked for some help. Mark said, I can't leave right now, you know that, Fran. He suggested she call the police and get a protective order against Bert. The neighbor that lived next door had watched all the events that morning. She knew all about Fran too. This female, as luck would have it, was a yeoman that worked in the local JAG office. She sat down and took careful notes of the time and things down to what everybody was wearing. The reason she was at home was she had an appointment that morning and her supervisor gave her the morning off. When she got to the office, she softly knocked on the door of one of the JAG attorneys and told them what she saw and the names of everybody involved along with a man that was acting as peacekeeper she had never saw before. Okay, thanks, the officer said, and the female went back to work. As Bert and Mike ate breakfast, Mike noticed Bert was just playing with his food. What's on your mind, Bert? Mike asked. Where was Fran at and what happened to my pay, was his reply. Mike took a few moments to think about his reply. He had been warned many times by Lori, a therapist he works with, to never say the word Jody or say anything about a lover to a man in this situation. However, Mike knew that this was the only real explanation, because if Fran had a good reason to not be at the pier when that ship moored in, Bert would have expected it. Also, the missing money was a major red flag. So, Mike just said, Bert, what do you think the answer is? Bert said, Fran is cheating on me. Mike said, well, Bert, let's make sure of that before you accuse Fran of anything. Mike spent the next few minutes explaining to Bert how important it is to stay calm. Mike grabbed the bill and paid it. Said, call me tonight, Bert, and went home. Bert went back to his ship and asked to get duty so he could get his mind off Fran. Several minutes later the ship's executive officer called for Bert to come see him. The captain was off the ship in some meetings. The officer told Bert to hang tight and said he was restricted to the ship because Fran had filed for a protective order, and he had just been made aware of it. Then a petty officer spoke to Bert and said, let's take a ride to see JAG. Bert asked if he could call a friend and he was allowed to do so. He called Mike and told him about the protective order. Mike let out some expletives and said okay. When they got to JAG, a police officer was there and informed Bert of the order and told him he was to stay away from his home as well as Fran. The yeoman that lived next to them saw Bert and followed him outside and they spoke. She said she saw what happened and had already told a JAG about it even before they found out about the protective order. She asked Bert to come back inside with her and speak to this officer. She told Bert about what Fran was doing during the last deployment and she was sure Fran had several different men. Bert knew what was happening. After Mike hung up with Bert, he called an attorney and asked if they could help Bert through all of this. They said yes and told Mike to have Bert in their office in Virginia Beach as soon as possible. After Fran filed her complaint, she called Mark and said it was done. She was also planning to return to Maryland as soon as Bert's next pay hit the bank. Mark warned her to be careful. Fran said, well, I have almost $8,000 in my account. I want this last pay and I will stop. After I divorce Bert, I will get alimony anyway. Fran disconnected the phone and made plans to be at the bank the morning she knew the money would be in the account. By this time, she no longer cared about Bert, he was just an ATM to her. After Mark disconnected, he shook his head at how easy it was to get into Fran's panties, and he knew he had no plans to divorce his wife. He knew the next time he saw Fran he was going to demand she terminate her pregnancy. That afternoon Bert contacted the office that handles military pay and spoke to a lady and informed her of his wife's fraud. He had deposited some of the money Mike loaned him to open another account and had the pay redirected to that account number. He was not sure if it would take effect before that upcoming pay period but was assured the one after that was safe. Bert had spoken to an officer on his ship and was told they would do their best to help him get his pay before Fran could. He did have a friend that worked at that bank in another area and would be able to see when the deposit was made and help him. So that was what he planned. When that day came, Fran was sitting in the bank parking lot waiting for it to open. She did not know that Bert's friend had already moved the money from the joint account to his. Fran was livid when she was told there was only $5 in the account. "What am I supposed to live on?" "Sorry ma'am, the money was removed this morning." Fran was still angry when she returned home. That same morning the attorney was gathering statements from the yeoman as well as from Mike about what happened the day Bert returned home. He was getting ready for the hearing to either extend the protective order or terminate it. The attorney also was planning to hand Fran the divorce papers that same day. Fran showed up to the hearing and after listening to the attorney speak and saw the notarized statements, the judge ended the protective order and the attorney stepped in front of Fran and handed her the divorce papers and said, "You have been served." It took a while for Fran to catch her breath, but she started cussing under her breath as she walked out of the building. The next day Fran again headed back north to see Mark. When she got there, Mark was at home with his wife. She texted him and said she was staying with a school friend and had filed divorce papers. That evening Mark started his shift and went by where he knew Fran was. She came out and hugged him, but Mark ended the hug and pushed her away from him. "Fran, you need to take care of this baby. I can't have another child, I already have 2 with Diane and I am not leaving her." Then Mark pulled out of the parking lot and went to work. About 2 hours later Fran was knocking on Mark's front door and asked Diane if she could come in. Fran was about to go nuclear and started with Mark. Diane was a petite blonde and Fran left her in tears. Then she returned to where she was staying and quickly gathered her things and headed out to Interstate 83. About that same time Diane was on the phone to her parents and told them that Mark was cheating on her and was having a baby with the girl. She asked them to help her get back home in Arkansas and they said yes. Diane went to bed that night and slept with her daughter. When Mark finished with his shift, he returned home to see Diane was not in his bed. It took him about 2 minutes to see where she was. That next morning Diane made breakfast for the kids before she took them to daycare and to her job. She did not do anything for Mark, and he took note of the empty oven. That day Diane quit her job and told her boss she was returning to Arkansas. That afternoon after Mark started his shift with some help she got the kids' things as well as hers and loaded them up in a small van. She hid her car so Mark could not find it and traveled about 50 miles in the van and got a room using cash. When Mark got home that night, he saw the note Diane left and he sit down calling Fran a slut. Diane's father is a well-connected businessman in both Arkansas as well as Missouri and Oklahoma. He was able to get the divorce started for his daughter. Mark knew he was in trouble and traveled to a local store and bought a case of beer. When Fran got home, she discovered a notice from Bert to get the hell out of his house. He wanted to turn it back in. Besides, Fran would no longer be able to stay in it anyway and both knew it. Fran attempted to get Bert to stop the divorce. She even put almost all the money back in the joint account. Bert just told Fran they were done, and she needed to move on. "Bert, I am pregnant, I need help." Bert told Fran that baby can't be mine, you need to tell lover boy to step up. "You will never pin that on me. However, because you are my wife, the Navy will help you with childbirth and I will make sure our divorce is not final until then." That is all I can do, Fran. About 5 months later, Fran had a beautiful baby girl she named Heather. Diane filed for divorce and got child support and alimony for 2 years. Mark was forced to sell the house and send half of the money to Diane. Mark was present when Heather was born. Bert had asked for and was transferred to work ashore to finish his enlistment. Mark took Fran in, but within a year was already cheating on her. The day Bert left the Navy, he was sitting at a local bar with Mike, and they were talking. Mike reminded him that not all females are sluts. When you get home, give that some serious thought, but take your time and be careful. Mike dropped Bert off at the airport and drove home. As Mike entered his apartment, he got a phone call that another sailor was in a local jail. He signed as he flipped around and left his home.